Hello, everyone. My name is Anna Smith, and I'd like to welcome you to our third session for the 2024 Theory Method Speaker Series. I have some introductory remarks, and if you've joined us for any other talk, some of this will sound familiar. But while I make these introductory remarks, I welcome those of you joining us today to introduce yourself in the chat function. So you can find chat at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And then as you open up chat, if you could toggle the radio dial from hosts and panelists to everyone. We'd like to invite you to introduce yourself, what relations you're bringing with you to today's conversation. We're going to keep the chat open to allow for a dialogic experience. So please respect that and keep your comments productive. So the Theory Method series comes to us from the Education Now Lab at the Illinois State University at the School of Teaching and Learning. From the School of Teaching and Learning. The Education Now Lab is a community-engaged research practice lab that works with and produces a range of critical, interdisciplinary, public, academic, and new media scholarship with and alongside community members as we labor toward more just educational futures. And you can imagine why we're so thrilled to have our speakers with us today, given our aims with that. So you'll be able to find some information and video recordings of our past sessions at our Education Now Lab website, which I'll share in just a moment in the chat. But I have some thank yous first. We want to thank Alexis Adams in the graduate school. She has been doing all the behind scenes work to get people registered for the call and the recordings from the call and all of that. We'd like to also thank Fakayo Olutomowa, who is in the School of Creative Technologies, and she has been doing all the work for the website presence and to get the recordings posted and communication about the series. So I'd like to thank them. And then finally, we want to thank the Office of Research and Graduate Studies, who is funding this series. And we want to recognize in thanking them the continuous ways that our work at Illinois State University is supported by histories of dispossession that have allowed for the growth of this institution over the past 160 plus years. And specifically the harm inflicted by our institution on being built in the lands and waterways of multiple indigenous nations who were forcibly removed, including the Illini, Peoria, and Miami, as well as honor the indigenous people who have been excluded due to the historical erasure and inaccuracy. And, you know, as this whole series, we've been seeing these sustained struggles and atrocities about people and lands in the current events. And so I hope that throughout this whole series, and specifically tonight too, that we can take the insights and the energies that we're getting from tonight and turn them to action in our own communities toward communal well-being and flourishing in the best ways we can. So with that, I'm going to introduce our guests tonight. They are Dr. María Paula Ghiso and Dr. Gerald Campano. They are individually and collectively award-winning scholars. And their award-winning is both from scholarship to grants, as well as mentorship, which so many of us have benefited from and learned from. And so Dr. María Paula Ghiso is professor of literacy education in the Department of Curriculum and Teaching at Teachers College, Columbia University, and her scholarship investigates literacy in multilingual and transnational contexts and community-based research methodologies. And Dr. Gerald Campano is professor of literacy studies at the University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of Education, and his scholarship focuses on practitioner research, immigrant identities, critical literacy, and university community partnerships. And I could list all of the awards and the accolades, but it would take us all night. I wanted to get to what we're talking about tonight. They most recently collaborated with their CARE initiative colleagues, with whom they've been partnering over a decade across boundaries of race, language, immigration status, and institutional affiliation in South Philadelphia. CARE stands for Communities Advancing Research and Education Initiative, and they've collaborated in publishing the text Methods for Community-Based Research, Advancing Educational Justice and Epistemic Rights. And of course, I left my book at home tonight when I wanted to hold that up, but we will share a link to that work as well. So this work, I imagine, is also going to be award-winning very soon, if it isn't already, if you all know something I don't know yet, but it should be. It lays a case for and provides examples of research as an epistemic right of people and communities. This is through community-based inquiry methodologies premised on the ethics of care, love, and interdependence. So we were just having a great conversation about love before we started the call. This description I really liked. So the book shifts assumptions about who is considered a researcher, drawing attention to issues of power and ethics and collaborations, and foregrounding how those who have been often positioned as the objects of educational interventions can and have the rights to play an active role in creating educational arrangements more conducive to their own flourishing. So with that, I'm just really excited to learn with you and from you both tonight.
Thank you so much, Dr. Smith and everyone here. We're so thankful for this opportunity and excited to be in dialogue with you about this work. And I'm just going to share my screen for a minute to share our presentation as we go. So let's see, hopefully everybody can see that in a moment. There we go. Thank you. And as we just mentioned, the work we're going to be sharing today is part of the long-term partnership that we've had since 2010 with the Communities Advancing Research and Education Initiative, or the CARE Initiative, which has brought together families, youth, and community leaders from South Philadelphia to investigate issues of educational equity and literacy. We're both from the literacy disciplinary backgrounds. The partnership has been really special, and we'll hope to share a little bit more with you, some details, but it's been intergenerational, and it's been working across boundaries, whether they be boundaries of culture, race, language, institutional boundaries. We've worked with the Philadelphia Indonesian community, the Latin and specifically the Mexican community, and the Concerned Black Catholics from the St. Thomas Aquinas Parish when we initially began to form the partnership. And since then, as partnerships go, and with precarity and leadership turnover, it's really kind of expanded beyond the parish setting. And so there's a picture of us over the years. We've really, in the first book that we've had many collaborators, and we shared a little bit of the different inquiries that we've done throughout the years that have been community-led, and we'll share a little bit more about that today. But actually, what we're most excited to share about is really the methodological practices, both the commitments that we have and also how these sort of show up in our day-to-day practices of research. And so as a way into the partnership, both the ethos of the partnership and the way this maps onto the day-to-day workings of the school, of our research, we wanted to highlight, kind of start off with a story, and this is a t-shirt story. And we think it's one example that sheds light on many, many, many moments that we live daily in the work we do. So it was a Sunday afternoon. It was one of our regular working inquiry sessions with the group. We have both elders and youth working together, and we've been working for a long time on some co-authoring practices to go public with our research. And the group was working on co-planning a forthcoming presentation for the ARA conference, which last spring was held in our city. One CARE member, Maria H., proposed that we needed a visual statement of our group to represent our research values. And so she sketched the following image of a tree, discussing its roots in what nourishes us as a research community, the branches as the interconnected projects continually growing to help our communities, and the care that really holds us together. Then one of the youth from the Indonesian community, then a senior in high school, digitized the image. We all worked together to figure out the multilingual representation of the word care that would go together, as well as the logistics. Here's just one example of our many text messages and WhatsApp messages to think about how we would actually bring this idea to fruition. And the idea of that these logistics are not just logistics, but also communicate the kind of ethos and commitments of the group. And so we got recommendations for a community-owned business where we could print the shirt. Finally, one of the CARE graduate students, oops, there's the big shirt, picked up a big box of the shirts right before our session, organized with everybody who was attending to figure out when they would get the shirts and how they would wear it so we would all be ready for our session of going public with our work. It was one of the many intentional practices that helped make the institutional space our own. And I would say that the families that we've worked with, families of color and from immigrant backgrounds who have often been excluded from conversations about school improvement and whose presence has been really policed in schools, they were not just at the table, but really setting the dress code. This t-shirt, I would say literacy event, signals several aspects of community-based research and education and how we've tried to enact our principles in our practices. One, it's an example of how community priorities and perspectives have led the way in the research we undertake together, including how we go public with our work. It's highlighted the relationships and care that animate our research and really sees the labor and logistics as an integral part of and not ancillary to the research process. So in the remainder of the talk, we want to give an overview of the guiding principles for our methods and also share some concrete examples of what this means for the research process.
All right, thank you so much, Maria. And again, thank you, Anna, for organizing this and all the students. It's such an honor to be here. So much of what motivates the work that we all do in the CARE initiative is really trying to challenge, really kind of dominant extractivist approaches to research that are almost like hardwired into the education system and in many ways hardwired into academia. And, when we say extractivist, one of the several thinkers that we turn to really help us think about this is the philosopher Linda Martine Alcoff. And, she has an article where she's discussing museums, right? And also biopiracy, just the ways in which indigenous knowledge systems are really kind of like appropriated by corporations. And talks about how extractivist approaches to research really have these four features. And they're in this quote, but just to reiterate them, this idea of like ranking knowers, who has knowledge and who doesn't, or who semi does, really denying this need for collaboration, really looking at things outside of their relational contexts, and seeking, appropriation and control over intellectual items in almost a very kind of like neoliberal way. For us in the CARE initiative, just one simple way to think about extractivist epistemologies comes from the community members that we work with, who have said really 15 years ago from the very beginning, one of the things that really distressed them was the ways in which, individuals, researchers, but also politicians, also even community organizers, who claim to speak for the community, have come in and in the words of one of our colleagues, says, take our stories and leave, or come to the community and take the knowledge and disappear. And so, how do we imagine an alternative to that? So even before, we read Alcoff's work, Maria Paula and I realized that we needed to be really explicit about the ethical and professional norms which guide the work we do. We've worked with generations of just really incredible doctoral students over the years, most of whom really had an intuitive understanding of this kind of work, and that's why they were attracted to this project. But at the same time, the dominant pull of the academy to be extractivist, to lionize quote unquote individual brilliance, to grab data quickly so you could publish, etc., had a huge sway. So we felt like we really needed to kind of put down in print, and theorize alongside our community members what are the norms that guide our work. So these were them, and they're not written in stone. They're ever evolving, and they can be changed and added to. But I think they get to the heart of some of what we're talking about. One of them is this idea, from Rancière of the presumption of radical equality. So like equality is not something that we're going to strive for. Like we're unequal now, but we're going to support youth in getting a college education, and there'll be knowledge producers at that point. No, we presume everyone, irrespective of any ascribed aspect of their identity, is a theorist, is a leader, is an intellectual, is a researcher, and that's just the presumption that we come in making. Community members' knowledge and perspectives must be taken seriously. There's a concept which is near and dear to our hearts, around the epistemic privilege of minoritized communities. And, those who are most directly experiencing oppression and inequity are in a unique position to inquire into those issues of power and equity and transform them for the better. And then, of course, the research at every stage, not just about, gaining access to participants, but every stage of the research process needs to be co-designed alongside community members. And obviously, whatever work we do, we really have to make a strong case that it's beneficial, for the whole group, the whole care initiative. And also thinking about the ways in which research needs to go public and transparent, collaborative, and creative ways. And one of the things I might just say now, this project would not have been possible were it not for Alicia Rusoha, Grace Blair, Ankita Kurta, just generations of Gordon Diasa, doctoral students who bring their own like incredible brilliance and creative alchemy, with the community members to the project. And there's also been generations of youth and community members who have joined the project. So this is really not about, individual brilliance. This is really very much about collective brilliance. But individuals need to have certain virtues to do this work. And when Maria, Paula, and I were reflecting on it for the book, we realized, more important than something like GRE scores or something ridiculous like that, we need people who have empathy, critical empathy, right? Really can understand others but not conflate the distinction between self and other, and want people who are very attentive to issues of power. We need individuals who really have solidarity with those who are engaged in social struggle. And finally, this value of epistemic pluralism, that there are multiple ways of knowing and being in the world. Maria, if you want to go to the next slide. So one of the ways we kind of like thought about community-based research and education, its mission is really to advance the epistemic rights of all people, right? And so this is inspired by a Potterized notion of the right to research, but we like the term epistemic rights and participatory justice because we think that, research shouldn't be narrowly conceived, that there are many different epistemic practices that are always already organically happening in communities. So its inquiry is not either or, it's not like university-based knowledge versus community-based knowledge, but it's really valuing the multiplicity of the ways in which people engage and inquire into the world. And again, this has so many different intellectual legacies, including from Black studies, Moten's notion and Stefano Harney of study. But I think even more basically, one of our community researchers and activists, Olivia, put it really succinctly. Olivia comes from a mixed status family. She herself is DACA, but she says when you're navigating systems of oppression, you are always adopting an inquiry stance and you are always generating knowledge about the world. And so that's been really important to us. So also, in our efforts to democratize knowledge production and expertise and to advocate for participatory justice, it's really important for us to be specific about what are the injustices, that we're trying to address. And here again, we turn to so many feminist philosophers, including like Miranda Fricker and Jose Medina, who talk about these injustices such as hermeneutical injustices, which is, when individuals really don't have access to the interpretive resources to make sense of their experiences. And we think about how this happens in school all the time, right? With the attack on critical race theory or book banning, you know. And so an important aspect of community-based research is really to collectively pool the hermeneutical resources for everyone, all individuals, to make sense of and take action on their experiences. There's also testimonial injustices, which discredit people's, capacities as knowledge generators based on an aspect of their identity, for example, their education level or their proficiency with English language, etc. And finally, and one of the hardest, is agential injustice. That in community-based research, we also, try to create the conditions not just for people to like, inquire into their worlds, and share their knowledge, but also transform education systems for the better. And so when we think about like the opposite of extractivism, we were like, well, what would be the opposite of that? And one way to think about the opposite is really research methodology as a practice of love. And obviously, this concept of love and research is very inspired by scholars such as Bell Hooks, and also, for me personally, Michael Hart, especially in a lot of interviews he has. Um, and even going back to Martin Buber, right? Because if we think about the ways extractivist approaches to research really epistemically objectify others, right? And what we're trying to do is the opposite of that, is really recognizing everyone we work with as not objects, right? Not I-it relationships, but I-thou relationships, as fellow travelers, right? And co-theorizers and co-inquirers. And I think the other aspect of this love, which is I think really important, is that, love can really be used to scapegoat others. They're very narrow and violent definitions of love, such as a type of jingoism or nationalism that scapegoats or excludes others, including immigrants. And we see that a lot in the political discourse. But this is really a love that embraces multiplicity, a love that embraces difference. And we always go back to Audre Lorde, right? Audre Lorde's concepts of the interdependence of non-dominant differences. And that's why, as Maria Paula said, this work, the fact that it's intergenerational, that it's cross-racial, that it's really based on solidarity, and really based on cultivating not just an individual critical consciousness, but a group critical consciousness, where we learn from and are aware of one another's struggles, and we're invested in one another's liberation.
And so you see that reflected in how the care members talk about the work we do together. This is a quote. These are two community elders, Maria and Daria, who have been there in the partnership since the beginning, reflected on the role of care in research. And I'll just highlight, how knowing each other and understanding each other builds solidarity, which is what Daria is saying in this more extended quote here. And she at the end talks about, because if I didn't care about Maria, would I care? Would I care what she says? I would think, and that's her problem. But once we get to know someone, then we make it our problem. It's our problem. And not just these two members, but many of the members of the CARE initiative have talked about the role of relationship building in, working across difference and working together towards a common goal, which is to change some of the inequities that they're experiencing in the education system. And so when we think about community-based research in education, I'll just highlight a few of these and then we'll show some examples, is really the goal of creating a greater flow of knowledge of people and care work between the university and the community. And we put those in quotes because these are not insular spaces, right? And also thinking of community as a verb and not just you're in or you're outside the community, but who constitutes the community, what practices, what's the heterogeneity and between members of the community. It's not a romanticized notion. It's something that we work towards and through in the research that we do together. As we think, for example, about the dynamics of power in our relations with one another and in the research process that we're trying to undertake. And really that, we want to be committed to culturally relevant and collaborative design over time. So what does this look like to rethink the research process so that it's more inclusive, so that it's attentive to the knowledge that people bring, and so that we're always learning from each other and bringing multiple perspectives to bear on a situation. So creating these conditions for collective inquiry and epistemic determination. And and epistemic interdependence, excuse me. And I think really it's not a how-to, so but we're just giving our examples of how we've tried to think about these ideas together. To think about how do you develop and sustain collaboration? What does it mean to have this lens on the entire research process? It means this is us gathering together at a dinner in a local community-owned restaurant. So one learning has been that it's involved a lot of food over time, as most good things do. And this idea of consensus building and research designs as having a pedagogical element has been really important to us, and something that's come out as we've reflected and looked back over years of data that we've collected together, and we've really inquired into what's made this work possible. And we ourselves, many of us on the team are educators and current and former educators, but also that there are pedagogical practices in activist communities, which many of the leaders in our group have brought and taught us about how to facilitate making decisions together and thinking about next steps and thinking about action. And so it's actually really shifted some of the language that has been used, that people use to talk about research, because there's a lot of language, for example, of demands, which is activist language. And it's not necessarily language that, we hear in our own training, but there are the reasons for doing research, and findings are not just findings, they're demands for different changes that we might want to make. So we'll share just a couple of examples. Over the years, we've done a lot of different inquiries, and we're not going to go through all of them, but what I would say is that they're really developed on the ground slowly based on what people have questions about and want to tackle together. So there might be things around high school or college access because people have experienced certain things, or because something's coming up that we need to figure out how to navigate. And there's been documenting experiences around the material conditions and practices of schooling. There's been documenting and learning about community knowledge, but there's also been, now that we know these things, trying to change things, but also trying to construct alternatives that youth and families could participate in. And of course, we're very thankful to students over the years that have spearheaded some of those initiatives. We've expanded both the idea of what counts as data, and how to go public with data. These are community posters that were created as part of a Photo Voice project to investigate community educational practices as well as families' experiences with schooling. And I just want to, I'm not going to read all of this, but I just want to bring to the surface. These are words by María Hernández, one of the community elders who you saw in the earlier picture. Our meetings are usually multilingual. Sometimes we communicate, English is a language that most everybody can understand to some extent, but people speak in whatever language feels most comfortable to them. So Maria here was sharing about what she sees the role of the group in Spanish, and then also talking in English as well. And this is the language of demands, right? It's not about attacking the teacher or the director of the system. It's making a demand or a requirement, right? That altogether we can make a change. And when she was first speaking in Spanish, but when she talks in English, she really challenges the notion of immigrant students, immigrant families, and says, we're seen from a deficit lens. Sometimes schools give us interventions to help quote unquote, our students acclimate, succeed. Often they're not working. And she says, it's not poor you, poor you because, you don't understand English. She says, no, not poor me. I'm proud, right? She's proud to be who she is. Her identity and experiences are resources that help us see what's missing in the education system. And she's saying, like, we're here, we're visible, and we can make it better. And so that's really been the ethos of the group. And being mindful of time, I'm going to go a little quicker in some of these, but I want to share just another example, right, of youth leadership. One of the high school students who had been with the project since she was in kindergarten was in the process of doing a chapter that was about recommendations for arts-based teaching. And for that, they went to see a mural in Chinatown, in an area where she went to school. And when you see the full mural on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side is what they encountered when only one sliver of the mural was visible in this new building that was there. And this youth had been involved in community activism, had been involved in a local organization that Asian Americans United, and she helped to bring this issue to our attention around the threats that the Chinatown neighborhood is experiencing in Philadelphia due to a development project that's being proposed and moving in the area for the construction of the 76ers arena. And so from that, we met with the youth were interested in doing a project. We were interested in supporting them. We tried to meet with community elders to think about what could we do? What might this look like? Some of what they said was, how is this working with other things going on in the area? How will this benefit the community? How will it benefit the youth themselves? And so we tried to, as we were recruiting youth, to plan what the project was. It was in conversation with others in those networks. These are four of the youth when they presented at AERA around this inquiry, and showing some of the murals that have been made in the area of community elders. That particular community elder has been involved in the CARE initiative's early days. So there's just been a lot of wonderful interconnections and a network that's been built over time that couldn't have happened much earlier in the process. I'll just say real quickly that some other folks who had been involved in the project talked to the youth about culturally relevant and interviewing, and what does it mean to how could this project benefit the community? And so they were involved in some of that. They interviewed others and collectively analyzed some of the data. And then they've been thinking about, across all our projects, how do you go public in creative ways? And so I hope that you can see that there's kind of an involvement of everyone across the project, across all these aspects of the research process. And there's also just an openness to expanding what counts as data, what counts as gathering data, what counts as going public. So I'll show just a couple of quick examples. Thinking about authorship in expansive ways as a form of intellectual activism. These are stills and photographs that youth themselves took from a participatory documentary that we co-created. Thanks to Diasa, who was a filmmaker prior to coming to do his doctoral studies. And so kind of building on his background, he involved the youth and really recruited the resources of the university for these endeavors, right? And so here are the youth are going to the filming studio at the university libraries, where they were able to record interviews with members of the team and really be central to these processes. And so it's not just about the university going into community context, but it's also about blurring those boundaries and students being more central to university spaces. And that doesn't mean that, you know, because we want to expand and have different forms of representation, that it's not an either or, right? Families and youth are also invested in academic writing and other forms of knowledge production that's valued in the academy. And so these are shots from our collaborative authoring process with families and youth for an article that was recently published. And it's a long process, right? Because we all speak different languages. We have to think about, what does it mean to detach language and literacy proficiency from knowledge? And how do we create the spaces for everyone's knowledge to be valued and visible, and that's been very much pedagogical, right? And bringing back, you know, drafting together, recording, bringing things back, and it's been a slow process that really challenges the timetables of the university, but is very, very much, you know, meaningful to everyone involved. And so I'll give it over to Gerald to
Yeah,
close.
if you can go to the next slide, because I just want to make sure we have some time for dialogue. But when we think about the impact of this work, one of the ways we characterize it as really kind of the impact really has to be about fostering individual and collective self-determination. And so part of what that means is we don't measure the metrics that we use to measure the value of the work are not the metrics of those in power. But really, it's, the value of the work is really about meeting the concerns, but also the desires of the community members themselves. So we made this like little nested set of circles to kind of talk about impact in different ways. And of course, individuals, benefit, but one of the things we always emphasize is there's no separation between individual and collective flourishing. Like you can't have one without the other. We've done this work for a long time, and we started with a big group of children who were like kindergartners, and that was 15 years ago. And just about to a person, all the youth that we've worked with, have gone on to institutions of higher education. And again, that was never our goal, but invariably in the act of doing research, they've done a lot to demystify academia and critique it, but also make it their own. So right now, as we speak, we have like two of our young scholars, at Yale, several at Penn, Swarthmore, Temple. One got into Princeton, and just, that was kind of like, but that was also one of the desires of the parents, right? To gain access, to these institutions. And so we were happy, to support them in that. I remember one of our students when he was in middle school, he had done so many presentations and had done so much writing that he had more academic publications than I did as a third year assistant professor, trying to get, tenure at my first institution. But it doesn't stop at the individual, right? One of the most important things is that in the community developed what we call a local intellectual commons, that they pooled all the knowledge that they generated from years of inquiry and research. And it was really powerful because, might have high school youth, researching, for example, anti-Black racism or anti-Asian racism or the material conditions of the school system. But then the younger generations, because they were part of the group, almost absorbed all that knowledge osmotically, right? And, we collected the research and the research artifacts and the articles that they wrote. So this really powerful alternative intellectual community developed that was really a type of a commons. And Dr. Smith was mentioning earlier what are the ontologies of research. And when we think about sometimes we have a very conflicted relationship because with the public schools in Philadelphia, they really are a mechanism of social reproduction, but at the same time we want to support them, right? And they can also do a lot of good. But in the act of doing community-based research, we're also trying to prefigure an alternative intellectual and social arrangement, really premised on these notions of care and interdependence, and really like universality, universal dignity, human dignity, and the universal capacity to generate knowledge. So in that spirit, in addition to like this local intellectual comments, one of the things we realized that was happening in the research were that there were these ever expanding kind of like networks of care and support. So as more people heard about the research, we had young people from the suburbs come in and join. We had other colleagues who became involved in the project, and former children who were part of the project who went on to college. They created their own kind of college access groups. And so like all of a sudden, we really see how this work has just expanded over time. And then finally, what we would count as part of the impact is that so much of this work really kind of um, but is nourishes and is nourished by larger movements for social justice and equity. So, for example, Maria Paula mentioned that a number of our youth were involved in saving Chinatown in Philadelphia right now. The city's trying to build a sports stadium in the heart of one of the last remaining working class communities of color in the center of the city. And there's been just a tremendous amount of research and organizing in resistance to that. And so many individuals in the CARE initiative have been at the heart of that. But one thing I think is really important to say that those of us who are based in the university, we really have to be involved in social justice movements that critique and try to transform our own institutions if we're to have any credibility at all with the community. So, for example, I'm at the University of Pennsylvania, which has a very long history of gentrification, and Maria Paula alluded to that, of displacing working class Black, Brown, and immigrant communities. And I've had to be very vocal, and it's been a little bit, uncomfortable, but I've had to be very vocal, for example, about trying to get Penn to pay pilots, which means payment in lieu of taxes, right? So Penn, as a private institution, does not pay any public taxes to this public school system, which is severely under-resourced. So our young people, for example, have done research on this issue of pilots and the civic responsibility of these, hyper wealthy and affluent institutions with billions and billions of dollars, of endowments, right, to give back to these communities and these cities that have enabled them to flourish. That's, I think, another kind of impact that isn't always talked about in college, in kind of traditional methods, I guess, courses. So with that being said,
And I saw, we'll stop for questions, but I saw that some people were maybe like wanting resources or wanting links. We don't have a website, but we do have the film that folks helped participate in and make. And so we're happy to share any resources with you all and be in conversation about this.
Wonderful. I was just going to ask you if you did have a site. I think I found the trailer, but I don't know if I found the film. So we also can, if you have some things you wanted to send me to later, we can curate them on the Education Now Lab website. We'll make sure people have that link too if we don't get them tonight. So thank you so much. The depth at which this work is meaningful, right? Like it's motivating to think about how we can do things differently in research. So speaking of doing things differently, Crystal Machado had a question. They asked, how do you get IRB approval? Is it more difficult? So yeah, let's start with that very practical. How do you work within and against the institution at the same time, right?
Yeah, I'm going to let Maria Paula, as an expert on IRB, I'm going to defer that to her. But one of the things that actually to us has been much more important than the institutional IRB, which we did do, right? And, but was that especially at the very beginning of the project, we had a community-based IRB. So we had representatives from the different cultural and linguistic communities. This work initiated at a Catholic parish, right? And before we even did research, Maria Paula and I spent 2 years just hanging out and trying to support the community members in initiatives that were already occurring. But they really had the desire. They invited us to kind of think alongside them. They wanted to do research. And then we eventually had a lot of doctoral students who are also kind of doing research alongside community members. But before anyone did any research at all, they had to actually present the work in front of a community-based IRB. And I just really want to shout out one of my close friends and mentors, Dr. Tarajin Yazimans, um, who does amazing work with supporting early childhood and Native communities throughout all of the United States. But very early on in my career, she was the one who really, helped inspire me about the importance of the community being involved in every step of the process, including, the IRB process. Maria Paula?
Yeah, and I'll just add that, well, at Teachers College, actually, faculty are on the IRB review, so I've learned a lot from my colleagues about that and kind of the openness of the IRB to understand different methodologies and to take this into account. I think and so that's a role that we can all do if we're situated in institutions, is to talk about how this the principles of this work and to help create processes for those approvals that kind of are in line with its principles. I think one I wouldn't say challenge, one balance has been, how do you um, leave it open-ended enough so it's community-led, but not anything goes, right? And I think that the IRB process had been helpful in that way because it's not that anything goes, right? It's and it is usually centered on certain ideas, but sometimes like the disciplinary focus has been a little different. We've been I think one positive has been we haven't done the research in schools. We've had out of school community settings for the research, and they really are about inquiry processes, and so we're documenting youth and our own meaning making practices as well as the insights that they have. So we've been able to kind of balance, I would say, the open-endedness with sharing how that won't be a risk, right, for others, and that risk and benefit ratio. I think one challenge for IRBs, at least, in our experience, we are in two different institutions, and that has meant that we've had to do two different IRBs for each project, for the same project. And, you can see how we have to mediate that. And fortunately, we've developed trust with community members so that when they're asked to sign the same form twice, it just doesn't look suspicious, but it is just an additional hurdle that, has been difficult because it's not set up for collaborative work in that way.
That is so key. So I'm going to try to keep, we have some questions coming in the Q&A and some in the chat. And so everyone's welcome to add questions in either place. And then what I'm going to do is just kind of bounce between the two and share some of these questions, and we can continue the dialogue. So Elizabeth Morgan asked, how can we additionally, how can we advocate within our universities for this kind of work, especially when it challenges traditional and often harmful research practices? What strategies can help build institutional buy-in for more community-centered and transformative practices? And I'm thinking about in the book, you talk about how this is often it's demeaned sometimes within the academy as this is service work, or this is right, rather than the opposite. So how can what are some ways that you found to create some buy-in?
Yeah, well, one of the things which I think has been really helpful is, over my lifetime in the academy, I really feel like there's beginning to be a paradigm shift, right? And we think about the idea of like, really prestigious organizations like the Spencer Foundation and William T. Grant. They've had some amazing leadership with scholars like Megan Bang and Nyla, right? Who really are supporting research practice partnerships. And we think that, community-based research is like one variety of that. And so there's a movement now where people are saying, are really saying like we have to do this work alongside communities. So with that being said, it's still very much a challenge. Like we're trying to here at the University of Pennsylvania, um, really develop, this is slow research in many ways, especially kind of getting it off the ground. But we're trying to develop in fact, I have to talk to colleagues next week about community-based research and the importance of developing criteria for like tenure and promotion processes and merit processes as well. But I think that so many of the younger generations of scholars, like they're not going to have it any other way. Like one critique that I've heard of just partnership research is, people saying, "Oh, we really believe in it, we think it's important, but wait till later in your career, like after you have tenure or whatever." Aside from the fact that, tenure is becoming increasingly rare and we have more and more, faculty who are in precarious positions, but younger generations of scholars, at least the ones I work with, they're just not having it. They want to develop equitable and ethical relationships from the get-go. Maria?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think that that's fantastic. And, I don't know if we want to get to a different question, if you think, or I'm happy to try to add on as well.
There are some really great ones.
I
Should we move on? I don't want to take up your whole entire night.
Answering that question that I got caught up in the others too.
Yeah. No, it's wonderful. And if you want to answer a particular one, please feel free. I was thinking about the question from email address in Kim. So do you think training for conducting research with community members, do you think training is needed for conducting research with community members in the process of, so what in the process of conducting research, is there particular ways you're thinking about sharing some of the research practices of maybe of the academy? Maybe that's where the question is. And local practices, yeah. I don't know if you saw that question in there. Okay.
I think, it's a little bit connected to the previous question. I think that's good. For us, part of our training has been in practitioner inquiry, and we think that, we were at one point researching our own classrooms, but now, practitioner inquiry, you're turning the lens on yourself, and practices are not just teaching practices. So what is our practice of partnering has been an ongoing research question for us, right? And so one way that, we've been able to, I would say, work towards legitimizing or making visible some of these methodologies and the labor involved, so that it's not coded as serving or just programming, which is all things that we have heard in response sometimes to articles that we've sent out, is to show that because the researcher and practitioner line is blurred, that all of these are research practices, right? But when you're making that visible and documenting it and showing it through, the hours of invisible labor that might be there, and you're showing how it's necessary for the research process, I think then that's something that can contribute to the research base and help hopefully provide other models or expand on that. And I do think, to this point of, that also helps us see the individual contributions that everyone makes, right? Because it is not just community knowledge or academic knowledge and in a dichotomous fashion, right? And we've learned that from community members themselves who have said, who have challenged our own assumptions and said, "Oh, you're asking us a lot about schools, but don't you know something about schools? Because weren't you teachers, and don't you train teachers?" And, so we don't just want you to hear from us, we also want you to talk and participate, right? And contribute. And so I think sometimes, a particular research direction requires particular research methods, and we have, shared that, and we've also asked other people have shared their expertise too. So it's been very much dialogic, and not everyone needing to do exactly the same thing.
Yeah, and I think all of us, whether we're university-based researchers or community-based researchers or something in between in the CARE initiative, we're all constantly trying to grow, right, in terms of the forms of inquiry that we engage in. And I think one powerful example of that is that our community members wanted to do surveys, And that's not something like Maria, Paula, and I do. But one of our doctoral students took the lead on surveys. But what ended up to be really powerful is that the community members themselves shared the ways their like negative experiences with surveys. And that knowledge was really important when we kind of collectively try to develop a survey that was like more culturally relevant, you know. Um, so I think, yeah, there are all sorts of ways, a multiplicity of ways to kind of generate knowledge. But I think that was a really fantastic question. And we do have, like our doctoral students who like love to kind of share what they're learning about, ethnographic methods with the youth, and then the youth go in and kind of like document their own, schools, etc.
So I'm not sure in terms of what time you have, but there is one question that we haven't really touched on, I think, yet, that might be interesting to end with. And this is from Lakshmi Oja's question. It says, you've talked about transparent research methodology in your 2016 book, Partnering with Immigrant Communities, Action Through Literacy. And I believe you talked about transparencies in your most recent text as well, and the key, the importance of that. Could you please elaborate on that a little bit more with some instances when you were transparent with community members and maybe any tensions? And that might be really helpful because it isn't romanticized, right? There could be, does an example come to mind when you worked through some tensions around transparency?
Oh my God, we could spend the whole, you know, I mean, there's been tensions in all sorts of levels. One of the tensions when we developed this partnership, you know, one thing that was really interesting is, there was a colleague of mine who, at the University of Pennsylvania, who was very interested in kind of the role of faith-based organizations and tried to kind of like intervene and play a role, working with the community that we had established trust with for so long. But this was a colleague who had coined the term super predator back in, like the 80s or 90s. And we had to really intervene and say there's no way that, you're going to get involved with this, with a community that we had cultivated this trust with, right? But even within, the community itself, there, you know, I, especially at the beginning, right? I mean, I think one of the things, we had a lot of tensions, and we talked about this in our first book, especially when we were working with the church, the Catholic Church itself. There were different people in the church who had kind of different centers of gravity with respect to the work and the roles that they wanted to do. So some people were more service oriented, some people were more pedagogically oriented, and sometimes this created some tensions. Um, that being said, what I think has been really important in our own research is our partnership has really been directly with the families themselves. So as leadership has changed over time in the institution, right, the partnership has been able to continue to flourish. And now it's actually no longer housed at the church, right? Now we're moving, to the university and community-based organizations like the Ginger Arts Center. But it's really like that relationship is less mediated by institutions that bring with them a lot of baggage and some degree of ideological conflict. Um, Maria, I didn't come up with a great example right
Yeah,
now.
no, I mean, I think that transparency, I had that a similar example of just, when we were working with the community center, right? Like we have certain commitments, but they also might have certain constraints too. So for example, who's going to be teaching these different classes that you want to teach, and we are interested in them being taught in a certain way and kind of co-creating curriculum. But then if you have a very, precarious staffing, it's not possible. How do you reckon with those discrepancies, right? And I think it has gotten easier. I would say that the transparency has been recently, I think we're much more on the same page, but that families keep, kind of holding our feet to the fire in a way to say, but what are we really going to do with this work? And is this really making a difference? Right. And trying to push us further to, um, to maybe take more direct actions or to form, even as we were trying to present about something, they said, like, what's really at the end of this? How are we helping others? Do we want to have a hotline? Do we want to do like a volunteer service where we're helping others? Because and that's where, we've tried to, like, they've been transparent with us about what they see the goal of the research being, at the same time that there's a lot of care in, the challenges to doing that.
Yeah, and I just might quickly add, that sometimes I think the relationships, like dissensus and conflict, is really important for collective like growth together as a community, but the love and trust enables us to work through the differences often. And so one example we talk about, I think, in this book is how around kind of like the prison industrial complex and how it relates to schooling, right? And this, after this period of mass shooting, one of our youth was, for example, at one point really making an argument for the need to have like metal detectors. And one of our parents, who was very involved in Juntos, which is a grassroots activist organization and very politicized, was saying, no, we cannot, treat our schools as if they're prisons. And you could see where both individuals were coming from, right? But at the same time, they had such love and trust for one another. They were able to dig deeper into the systemic issues and really ask, why do we even have to think about gun, any kind of violence, whether it's systemic, whether it's the carceral system or whether it's individual shooter? Why, do young people have to be concerned about any of these kind of violence? And then they went on to like even dig deeper and more systemically. And I think that's one example of the importance of the relational aspect, right? That we're gonna have difference, and actually it would be dangerous to kind of elide or suppress difference, but at the same time we can work through those differences to understand one another, where we're coming from, and to create this broader kind of consciousness, both about these intersectional issues of oppression, but also what our kind of collective liberation might look like.
Love that. On that note, thank you so much for your time and consideration. There were a few final questions, but I kept finding myself saying, if you can get your hands on the book, right? There's a great details about the roots of this work and the beginnings of this community that you've been nurturing together for so many years in the text. There's how do we lay the groundwork for this kind of work? Somebody asked that question as well, and I really appreciate the structure of your text as well, as you think through different aspects of the research process, and how these threads of community and mutual flourishing really come, how you make it go through every part, whether it's data analysis or whether it's distribution or whether right, all of these pieces. So I just keep recommending that text, and for anyone on the call.
Yeah, thank you. And Anna, also, especially if I got a small grant and I bought a number of copies of our books for people who, they're kind of expensive, these books,
Yeah, they are.
So especially if they're doctoral students or early career scholars who are interested in, doing kind of relational partnership or community-based research, I have just a certain number, but email me and I'd be happy to send you a copy.
That's wonderful. That's a beautiful offer, and hopefully there's enough text for all the emails you're about to get. So thank you so much to everyone again. I don't know if I think you posted your email address, but you could also just Google Gerald Campano and he will pop up. You could get your email from there. Oh, thank you, Gerald. So again, thank you so much to both of you for joining us, being in community with us here tonight. And we're just really, really thrilled for this. Oh, and thank you. Also, it sounds like there's some more resources. Dr. Shaheen posted, for anyone who has print disability, the book is also available in Bookshare. So thank you for that resource, Dr. Shaheen, and for everyone sharing ideas and comments. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.